Dr. Robert Sudmeyer is Research Officer with the Department of Agriculture and Food based in Esperance. Rob has 30 years' experience in resource management in farming systems, specialising in salinity mitigation, agroforestry and, more recently, climate change policy. Thanks, Rob.
Hi, everyone. I thought I'd start my talk with some caveats about modelling too, just to be like everyone else. And then I'd go on to talk a little bit about how global warming might affect agricultural systems. I think it's informative to look back a little bit at what farmers have been doing in the southwest to deal with a drying climate, because I think that informs what will happen certainly in the near term and possibly in the medium term. Then I'll look at a couple of papers that make some projections about the future, and then some simple conclusions. So we've seen this already, but I won't go through all the sources of uncertainty, but they're certainly there. This is where we're heading with business as usual. This is where we might get to if current international commitments are on it. And if we're very lucky with the Paris talks, this is where we might get to. So enormous uncertainty about that as well. When it comes to crop modelling, there's the similar sorts of problems that climate models have. There are differences between models, and it's been suggested that they're as great as the differences between climate models. And in Australia, we tend to use one crop model, and that's APSIM. So when you're looking at these papers and things, or projections, just be aware that that's one model, and we're not yet in a position to say how good it's been in predicting what's going to happen. Step changes aren't dealt well with, and technology and management changes aren't implicit in those models. You have to actually make some sort of fudge factors if you're going to put that in there. Likewise, disease and pest risk and climate extremes aren't dealt with. The crystal ball really gets murky when we start talking economics, because you're taking models and you're modelling that output, then you're modelling that output, and you're making another model, and then you're making a whole lot of assumptions about the costs of inputs, supply and demand, and technology changes into the future. And just to give you one example of how things might change and just how difficult it would be to actually capture those changes, it's been suggested that a 1 degree increase in temperature might reduce global wheat yields by about 6%, 5 to 6%. 5 to 6% of global wheat yields is 25% of the wheat that's actually traded internationally. And you can imagine if you remove 25% of wheat from the international market, prices are likely to skyrocket. This is in a period when populations are growing as well. So it might be that a farmer in the eastern wheat belt has declining yields, but the prices become so high that it's still profitable to farm there. But how do you capture that in a model? It's very, very difficult. It's just something that you just need to be aware of, I guess. So we're here. We've had about 1 degree of climate change already since the beginning of the last century. We might end up over here somewhere. Paris might take us here. Forget about how quickly we get there, what the ultimate temperature change is going to be, or how big those impacts will be. The key thing to take from this is that climate change is happening and has happened. It's likely to continue happening, and we need to do something about it. And hopefully we move ourselves from here over to here somewhere. So what happens when climate changes? Well, I think we already talked about this a bit, but CO2 is actually a fertiliser for plants. Plants need CO2 as a basic building block for starches and structural materials. So when you increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, you actually increase net photosynthesis or growth rates. Because you've got more CO2, the plants can actually then close their stomates and regulate their water use. So that actually improves their water use efficiency. The downside is that the nutritional quality of forages and grains and fruits and things can actually decline with increased CO2. So that has impacts both on livestock and human consumers of those products. Increased temperature is really a double-edged sword, and you might see more of the benefits in the south coast than the disbenefits, I guess. All plants have an optimal temperature and a threshold temperature. And the optimal temperature is the temperature range in which they photosynthesize at the greatest rate, and the threshold is the temperature above which photosynthesis begins to decline. And then if temperatures continue to increase, you start getting extreme temperatures and physical damage of the plant, either because they're too hot or perhaps when they're too cold and there's frost damage. So there are big differences between species, between cultivars, and during the life cycle of a plant in those temperatures. For example, for lettuce, the optimal temperature is between 12 and 21 degrees, and for sweet corn it's between 24 and 30 degrees. So there's a lot of leeway for farmers to actually manipulate what they grow, when they grow it, to actually deal with the changing climate. Phenological development, that's just how the plant develops from a seed to a mature plant, is actually directly related to temperature as well. So as temperatures warm, plants develop more quickly. Again, that's a double-edged sword. It can be good. If you're in a situation where you're growing a pasture and you want an early flush of growth, if you're actually increasing that at the start of the season, that could be a real benefit to someone who's got livestock. The downside is at the other end of the season when you actually compress the growing season, so that green feed is not there, or in the case of a crop, it might be that the period between flowering and grain fill is shortened and there's less opportunity to actually put starches into the grain. The final thing is vernalisation or winter chill. So some plants have a requirement that they're below 6.5 degrees for a certain period of time. That's to actually break seed dormancy or to set flowering or fruit. That's more a problem for horticultural industries and particularly fruit crops. This is probably going to be the biggest problem for agriculture, is decreased rainfall in the southwest. Yield is directly correlated with rainfall or water use for irrigators. And it's probably changes in seasonality, and this was touched on a bit earlier, that's going to be of most concern. So during winter, rainfall is often in excess of plant water use, but it's actually a limiting factor during seed establishment and grain filling at the end of the season. So if you see autumn or spring rainfall declines or shifts in when the rain falls, that can really cause some problems for farmers. And of course there's going to be reduced runoff into dams and recharge of groundwater, which is probably mostly a problem for irrigators, and we could probably hear a lot more about that in a minute. For livestock, changes in forage productivity or quality, that's going to impact that, and that's what we've talked about with plant growth. Water quality, availability and demand, stock drink more when they're warmer. And animal husbandry and health, and again this is a double-edged sword. In cold environments or during the winter months, increased temperatures can actually reduce the feed requirements of stock and also reduce their cold stress for lambing or off-shear sheep or something like that. During hot periods or in hot areas, as temperatures increase, then heat stress becomes a problem, which will actually affect the productivity of the animals and also their reproductive success. Just to give you an idea of how those things work together for crop, this is the results from a global analysis of crop models for wheat, maize and rice, but it's saying that yield will decline by about 0.5% for every 1% decline in rainfall, decline by about 5% for every 1 degree increase in temperature, and increase by about 0.06% for every 1 part per million increase in CO2. So it's quite a complex and interacting story. So we briefly touched on this too earlier. The climate has changed over the last 100 years, and particularly the last 40 years in terms of rainfall. We're seeing a shift southwards of isotherms and southeastward of isohyates. Farmers dealing with this have got a number of adaptation strategies they can actually use, and there's sort of a progression according to how intense the climate changes are. And as they go through that, there's going to be increasing costs and risks associated with undertaking those changes. Wheatbelt farmers are in here somewhere, so they're regularly undertaking incremental adaptations, and they're the sorts of things that are, well, there's some listed there: stubble management, nutrient management, different varieties or planting times, and some of the more traditional adaptations such as, well, things like precision agriculture or actually changing their cropping, stocking mixes on their farms. Just to to give you an idea, I don't want you to read this, but this is just a list of adaptations or things that are recommended for dealing with a drying climate or a drier, warmer climate. I really don't want you to read it. I just want you to know there's a lot there. They can't be recommended broadly. They're to be taken as an enterprise by enterprise sort of basis. And I'll give you an example of non-wetting soils. So in a high rainfall environment like Esperance, people are out there and they're claying the soil because they can quickly recoup that large expense in actually changing the soil because they get high crop yields and there's low risk in terms of climate variability. In a drier environment, claying is probably not the thing to do. People are tending to use surfactants. They'll spray it in the furrow so that it concentrates water around the seed so they get better germination. It also directs the water down deeper into the soil so it's actually stored in the soil with less surface evaporation. So although there might be a similar problem, the ways of tackling it will be quite different based on the farming system and their location. This is the results for a survey that was done between 2002 and 2011 for 250 wheat belt farms, and surprisingly it showed that 64% of farms were classified as growing or strong. And I guess most surprisingly, one of the most robust regions was the northeast agricultural region. But it was identified that better use of existing technologies, which is those incremental type adaptations, efficiencies at a scale, which is a more transitional adaptation, and moving to cropping, which is also transitional, were the adaptations that these growing and strong farmers were using. If we look at wheat yields, this is wheat yields in Western Australia between 1980 and 2015. This first one is just showing wheat yields on in terms of tonnes per hectare, and it shows, and there's been a steady decline over time, steady increase over time, and you can see it there, through to the late 1990s, after which the wheat yields become much more variable, and the trend of increasing yield actually flattens out. If we look at the bottom chart, that's water use efficiency, and it's kind of a measure of a farmer's ability to apply adaptations to actually deal with drying climate. And again, there's an increase, and fortunately the increase goes longer, but you can see there's also a trend of increasing variability after the 90s, and also the trend is actually flattening. That concerns me a bit because it's suggesting that our climate's becoming more variable and farmers are having less ability to actually deal with that by increasing their water use efficiency. There's been a couple of suggestions as to why that's happening. One of them was made by ABARE, because this is an Australian-wide phenomenon as well. They suggested that declining public investment in research and development in the 80s and 90s is now beginning to be felt. The other one was by Stevens, who actually put this data together. He suggested that farmers are becoming more risk averse in response to this more variable climate. They're actually reducing their inputs on their farms to actually manage risk, so they're actually reducing their potential yield. Either way, if that's happening, it does mean that that long-term increase in yield that we've seen in the past, that may be about to change unless there's some new technologies that come on the scene that farmers can adopt and actually go with while not increasing risk. This is some modelling work that was done by people from the Department of Agriculture. It's for wheat yield. It's the average between 2035 and 2065. And it's, I suppose the temperature and rainfall changes would be similar to what we might get if the Paris Accord, if everyone keeps their promises with that. So what it's showing is these yellow areas are declining yield in the wheat belt. So there's fairly extensive areas of declining yield. These red areas are very big declines in yield, and they really reflect the soil types in those areas. They're much heavier soil types, more clays. So when you've got situations of low rainfall, the plant available water on a clay is actually going to be less than on a sand. So those people are getting a double whammy there. This research really did show that for these people, they're going to get more low-yielding years and less those very high-yielding years, which are so important for actually making that agricultural systems work out there. So for them, risk is increasing. The lucky people here on the western edge of, I suppose it's the sheep belt really, This is just showing that their opportunities for cropping are actually increasing. And after all my dire warnings about economics, this is some predictions about changes in profit in future for a merino ewe enterprise. I guess what I wanted to show you here really is this is predicted yields given no adaptation, and the grey circles are predicted yields given adopting best practice type adaptations. And all I just wanted to reinforce with you is there are things out there right now that farmers can actually adopt and do that will increase their yields now and increase the profitability of their enterprises for some years into the future. So it's not all gloom and doom. There are things available for them to do. For horticulture, there's not going to be any real decline in horticulture. There might be a change in the species mix or the cultivars that farmers grow to reflect different temperatures. There was quite a nice study done in the southwest looking at wine production using very detailed downscaled information, and they found that wine and grape production would still be viable, which is great. And farmers identify access to water as their single biggest concern. And again, there are best practices out there to increase both irrigation efficiency and plant water use efficiency, so they can deal with it in the near term, but it's certainly an issue for them. In terms of resource condition, in those areas where the climate actually becomes more variable and there's a reduction in plant growth, then wind erosion risk is likely to increase on farming areas. Where rainfall intensity increases because of cyclones or storms, we might see some more erosion risk there, and soil organic carbon may decline as well. Secondary salinisation is probably going to decline as rainfall declines, but if it might be offset by less plant transpiration or in more intense storms causing episodic recharge. It's not clearly understood at the moment. So in conclusion, the effects of climate change are going to be felt by everyone in coming decades. Everyone's going to have to, in the farming community is going to have to deal with it at some level. Those in the marginal or currently marginal enterprises are going to be most affected, unfortunately. It's important that the agricultural sector is informed about what's going to happen and what they can do about it. And one of the things they always ask for is downscaled information. So they want really applicable regional information for them. And it also seems that that incremental changes, what are currently considered best practice, will continue to be useful adaptations in the short term and possibly in the medium term. But in the longer term and in those marginal areas, we're going to have to look more and more towards transitional and transformative adaptations. And a lot of those haven't yet been invented or thought of. So that's a challenge for governments and the farming community and the industry more generally. Thank you.